Welcome, everybody. I'm Joanne Geer. I'm the Executive Director for the Westchester Biotech Project, and we appreciate you coming with us today on our roundtable for researchers on building infrastructure for rare disease research. You'll be hearing from our speakers in a moment. First, I'd like to introduce you to my co-founder, Michael Welling.
Thank you, Joanne. Good afternoon, everyone. First, a hearty thank you to all of our speakers today for joining us, and this just represents certainly a topic that is near and dear to my heart, but certainly a concept that we know is so critical to moving forward in many facets of our fights against rare diseases. I'm fortunate that I am the father of a 15-year-old son who, when he was a child, was diagnosed with a rare disease, an orphan disease that required a few months stay in Sloan Kettering and stem cell transplants. And knock on wood, this is a happy ending story. We are examples of the best outcomes that we can find when we push the envelope, if you will, between the intersection of the art of medicine and medical research. And so I thank everyone today, both for their hard work, but also for coming and joining us today and sharing some of that insight. The Westchester Biotech Project was founded by Joanne and myself. I've lost track 5 years ago or so, but not after another year or more, 4 years ago, but it was 2 years of planning and dating between the two of us, and recognized how critically important it was and how big the need was for a platform to bring folks together like today, researchers, data scientists, engineers, to share not just their victories, but also their struggles. And the hope being that we can bring some folks together in an environment that maybe they wouldn't ordinarily have had the chance to interact, and we might be able to foster some collaboration that might identify new solutions that are desperately needed in the space here. So we are based in Westchester, or at least that's where we plant our flag, but we are truly a global organization. We are proud of our community from all over the state, the nation, and the globe. And it's really the contributions from this global community that has helped us sort of achieve the success that we have and sort of make the impact that I'm so proud of that we have to date so far. Obviously, it's not just the contributions, but it's the support of all of our partners, many of whom are laid out and shown on the screen here. And that support comes in so many different critical ways. And we always encourage anyone, should there be a name on here that looks like someone you might like to interact with, please let us know. We would love to make an introduction. And of course, if you are so moved by the magnitude of this list that you want to make sure your company name's up there, we would love to have that conversation and figure out a way to have you join our community partners as well. Is this a slide I'm handing it off, or am I still talking here?
Yeah, why don't you share a little bit about the Data Hub? I just like to include this because it's really pretty exciting and we're launching it as we speak.
Without question, threw me off there a little bit, but absolutely on the fly here. So as part of our effort to sort of help push that envelope of, you know, that cross section where medical art meets medical science, we have launched the Westchester Data Analytics Hub, an initiative that's really designed to help not only identify best practices in utilizing and analyzing big data, but being in a position to bring data-driven solutions to partners on the academic side, partners on the research side, and truly partners on the for-profit side, and creating an environment where we can bring all stakeholders together to design, whether it be research projects or answer research-driven questions, tap into the data to train the data scientists of tomorrow, and again, really build a foundation for moving the access and utilization of data forward. We have a number of events that we have held and continue to hold that are Data Analytics Hub driven. We obviously welcome everyone to participate and join us there. And the one thing that we know is behind every great idea is some form of data. And we just are looking to find ways where we can help solidify the data, improve the data, and more importantly, improve access to the data.
Nice job, Michael. Thank you.
Thank you. Phew.
And I will just say that I'm not going to go further on the Data Hub, but that if it intrigues you and you'd like to know more about it, we are starting to schedule some focus groups, sort of friends and family around to start sharing our plan. We're trying to raise $500,000 to kick it off, and beginning with some training for healthcare planning managers in how to work with data scientists. You'll be hearing more about that to come, but I'm very happy to get under the hood with anybody that would like to know more. I want to just introduce Kari Rosbeck, who is president and CEO of the TS Alliance, and she and her team are going to take us through their program. And then afterward, we will have a roundtable. And Prem Srinivasan is our discussant, which means he goes first, but we'll be inviting each of you to have a comment, ask a question, and so on. You certainly can use the chat, but if you just want to hang on to your question until we get to that part, we'll have plenty of time for it. Very good. Kari, welcome, and thank you so much for being here. Lisa, Steve, there you go.
Thank you, Joanne, and thank you, Michael, for having us. We are so honored to be part of your roundtable for researchers, and today talking about unlocking the cure for tuberous sclerosis complex and how we've done that by building the infrastructure for rare disease research. As Joanne said, I'm Kari Rosbeck. I'm president and CEO of the Tuberous Sclerosis Alliance. I've been with the organization for 20 years, have an expertise in fundraising and grassroots mobilization, and I'm honored to be joined today by Steve Roberds, who will introduce himself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Steve Roberds. I'm the Chief Scientific Officer at the Tuberous Sclerosis Alliance. I've been with the organization for 10 years now. And before that, I was in the pharmaceutical industry for 16 years. So I started at the Upjohn company when it still existed, and merged, became part of Pharmacia, and eventually acquired by Pfizer. I've my 16 years there were spent in ranging from early target discovery, starting new projects, then working on lead development together with chemists, because my background's on the biology side, and eventually into drug repurposing. We had a unit for 4 years dedicated to finding new uses for compounds that were in Pfizer's portfolio. So just wanted to give you a little bit of that background, and I think that'll help inform why Kari brought me on, and kind of the direction that we've headed in the last 10 years. And with that, I'd like to introduce Lisa Moss, our Vice President of Donor Relations, to introduce herself.
Thank you, Steve. Hi, I'm Lisa Moss, and I have been with the organization for almost 9 years. Prior to that, I was a volunteer with the organization as a community alliance chair, kind of boots on the street in the local DC area as a first point of contact for families diagnosed with TSC. And I started doing that after my son, who is 17, was diagnosed with tuberous sclerosis complex. It's been a real honor to shift to a role on the staff, and I work directly with our corporate partners and individual donors, and it's been a real thrill to be part of the organization.
So as you've heard, part of building our infrastructure is building our team and keeping our team intact, because we really feel that relationships are key. Today, we want to talk to you about what is the Tuberous Sclerosis Alliance, to give you some background. What is tuberous sclerosis complex? How we went about building a model system pipeline for patient-driven rare disease research. What does that mean to families living with TSC? And then Steve's going to take a really deep research dive into our infrastructure with the aim to change the course of TSC. So a little bit about the Tuberous Sclerosis Alliance. We were founded in 1974 by 4 moms, like many rare disease organizations, around a kitchen table. They were visionary in that they set a mission statement that were dedicated to finding a cure for tuberous sclerosis complex while improving the lives of those affected. We do that by sharing resources and information by anybody impacted by the disease, by funding and driving research, and then by creating and implementing both public awareness campaigns and also professional awareness campaigns to hasten the diagnosis and to begin to implement appropriate treatment for TSC. Next slide.
Sorry, it went too fast. So I'd like to just take a minute to give you a little background on tuberous sclerosis complex, or TSC, to help you understand some of the complexity and some of the reasons we take some of the directions that we do. So TSC is a genetic disorder. It affects about 1 in 6,000 live births. So we estimate about 50,000 people in the US and about 1 million worldwide. It's caused by mutations in one of two genes, the TSC1 or TSC2 genes. The proteins of those genes form a protein complex in the cell that regulates the activity of mTOR, the mechanistic target of rapamycin, which is a key enzyme in regulating cell growth throughout the lifetime. And so the impact of TSC lasts the lifetime. It also affects, for reasons that I won't go into right now, it affects everybody very differently, even identical twins. But there are certainly very common areas of the body that are affected. The brain is really the most impacted organ in most people. About 85 to 90% of people with TSC have epilepsy, about 40 to 50% have autism. There are also types of tumors that can grow in the brain. And there are tumors that grow in other organs in the body, primarily the kidneys, the lung, the skin, and sometimes other places like the heart and the liver. These impact people at different points throughout their lifetime, and illustrated from a chart I took from a fairly recent paper. Some of the manifestations of TSC are present before birth, such as the cardiac tumors in a significant portion of people. This actually helps us identify some people with TSC even before they're born by the presence of these cardiac rhabdomyomas if they're detected on prenatal ultrasound. But unfortunately, not everybody has, well, fortunately, not everybody has those, but unfortunately, not everybody is detected through that technique. So there's really still a need for early diagnosis and eventually newborn screening, we hope. There are other onsets of these manifestations. So the tumors in the brain typically occur during childhood. Tumors in the kidney may start in childhood, but usually become more problematic in adulthood. The manifestations in the lung, known as lymphangioliomyomatosis, or LAM, is the formation of cysts. It's catalyzed by the formation of nodules of TSC cells throughout the lung that can eventually lead to lung failure and the need for transplantation or to death. And the same with the kidney, can proceed to renal failure and eventually death. So some of the things that you've heard me describe may remind you of some more common diseases. So we think of TSC as a linchpin disease. So here's this rare disease, but it's got genes that are impacting a critical pathway that lead to things like epilepsy, which occurs at a much greater fraction of the population than just TSC. But what we learn about studying the epileptogenesis and the process of developing epilepsy in TSC may be applicable to the broader population. On the behavioral side, the neuropsychiatric side, with such a large portion, up to 50% of people with TSC developing autism, there's an opportunity to understand the progression of autism in this highly at-risk population at an early stage. And hopefully what we learned from studying TSC can also be applied to other non-syndromic forms of autism. And then of course, tumor growth is probably fairly obvious, certainly relevant to other cancers and other forms of tumor growth. So this is a reason that we think about, we're working on TSC, but we're also, what we learn, we hope will benefit the broader population as well.
When we look back at the first 23 years of the history of the TS Alliance, much of our research was really guided by our scientific advisory board in the late 1990s in general, focused on the discovery of the genes in the 16th and 9th chromosome. So the first 23 years, there wasn't tremendous progress in research, but once the genes were discovered, it really initiated quite a springboard for what was to come in the next 24 years. What we know is that the insert of the patient voice was extremely important. In 1998, we held our first consensus conference putting patients at the table with clinicians to set the gold standards for diagnosis, surveillance, and treatment in TSC. And then in 1999, the first national conference of patients along with clinicians to share the most relevant information on treating TSC and what families needed to know. In the early 2000s, we also launched our volunteer outreach program and our government relations program that really mobilized the community. And that kind of mobilization really led to lots of breakthroughs in TSC research. We also conducted our first constituent survey. Along that same timeline, we noted that TSC and the TSC genes and their relationship to the MTOR pathway, which exploded into 10 clinical trials and leading to the first approved drug in 2010 and a second indication for that same drug in 2012. That was to shrink tumors in the brain and kidneys in TSC. We also in 2006 really felt that we needed to understand the progression of TSC. And so we launched, the TS Alliance launched a natural history database to begin to catalog that. The next phases of implementation of research really happened at a constituent survey in 2010. In 2012, we formed a clinical research consortium along with clinicians from 5 key TSC centers. And from that, they began looking at biomarkers for autism and epilepsy in TSC. The Clinical Research Consortium applied for an NIH grant through the Rare Disease Clinical Research Consortium. And then in 2016, launched the first preventative clinical trial for epilepsy in the United States, which was very exciting. Our research programs that were supported by the TS Alliance also began to expand, and Steve will talk a little bit more about this, to include a biosample repository linked with a natural history database, a preclinical consortium, and of course, we launched a very aggressive research plan in 2019 following an externally led patient-focused drug development meeting that really provided insight into how patients and caregivers weigh risk-benefit in any new drug development process. And excuse me, in 2020, we were really excited about the approval of a second drug to treat epilepsy in TSC. So this is just an overview of the timeline of the infrastructure of rare disease research in TSC and the implications of having a patient voice involved in that. Now I'll turn it over to Lisa to talk about what that means for families.
Thanks, Kari. I'm honored to be here today to represent the TSC community and to share our family story along with some of the ways changes in progress have impacted families today. As Steve mentioned, TSC is a variable disease, and our son Evan has struggled with a lifetime of seizures, having too many kidney tumors to count, along with some other manifestations of the disease. He's a bit of a miracle child because he always seems to beat the odds, and in spite of all of the challenges we have as a family with TSC, we still consider ourselves pretty fortunate in the world that we interact in at this community. So Evan started having seizures his first month of life and was initially diagnosed wrongly with cortical dysplasia. So it took about 2 years to get a diagnosis, starting with an MRI that showed multiple tumors. And seeing this, the radiologist came out to talk to us and asked us if we'd ever heard of tuberous sclerosis. This was the very first time we'd heard those words. And when we said no, he turned on his heels and walked away because he wasn't supposed to be the person to provide a diagnosis or potential diagnosis. Through follow-up testing, a tumor was found on his kidney along with some white spots on his skin, and that confirmed that Evan had TSC. Today, infants, as Steve mentioned, can be diagnosed in utero through the identification of multiple heart tumors on an ultrasound, and it can lead to earlier treatment and better outcomes for families. By the time Evan was 3 years old, his seizures were out of control. We would wake up every morning and wait for the pattern of seizures to begin. He would typically have a seizure every 15 minutes until he took a nap or went to sleep. After failing multiple medications, we were just chasing seizures, and every day we saw his personality dim a little bit more. We knew that we were losing him, and really the choice to move forward with brain surgery was a very easy one and essentially was made for us. Evan went through a series of 3 surgeries to remove 3 tumors and spent about a month in the PICU. And then afterwards, after that last surgery, he was not able to walk, but we left the hospital with a really successful plan for rehab, and he was seizure free. So there was a lot to celebrate. And for the first time, we stopped expecting to see seizures. And today, there's a biomarker for epilepsy to identify children with a propensity to develop seizures, and also a preventative trial in epilepsy. When Evan was 6 years old on Christmas Eve, everything changed. My husband went in to check on him when he was sleeping, and he found him convulsing. It was the first of many seizures that would not resolve on their own and required us to administer a rescue medication to stop Evan's brain from seizing. Today, there's an FDA-approved mTOR inhibitor that can actually shrink tumors in the brain and the kidney, and CBD has been FDA approved for the treatment of epilepsy in TSC, which is exciting to have another option, other options for our families. We just continued to really struggle with epilepsy. Evan's seizures continued, and he courageously faced another brain surgery. This time was a little different because he was older and he was part of the decision to move forward with this. He added his own humor by asking the barber to put an arrow on his head so that the surgeon knew which side to go into. And then through after the surgery, once again, he was not able to walk. He went through physical therapy to learn to walk again, and was in an inpatient unit. And within days of the surgery, we were devastated when Evan had another seizure in the middle of the night. Our hope was that this was just part of the healing process, but in the months that followed, our worst fears were realized, and Evan would continue to have life-threatening seizures every 2 weeks. They lasted about 18 to 15 minutes. We often would call 911. And usually when the paramedics would arrive, Evan would be coming out of the seizure, but on the more dramatic occasions, we would be transported to the hospital. Today, there's also been progress in brain surgery, and laser ablation has been introduced, which is less invasive, has a faster recovery time, and patients often are released from the hospital just a day after surgery. So in comparison, I kind of like to think of it as outpatient brain surgery. So Evan today is 17 years old. He has a lot of personality and even participates in advocating for TSC research on Capitol Hill. If you met him in person, you would never guess all the things that he's gone through. He's funny, he loves swimming and gaming with his friends, and has the best recipe for homemade pizza dough. The mTOR inhibitor to shrink kidney tumors has successfully kept him out of the OR. I'm going to knock on wood as I say that in 3 days he will celebrate 7 months of seizure freedom. He's really turning into an amazing adult, and we feel so fortunate to watch him progress. As we look towards the future, for the TSC community. I'm really excited about the work being done through the Preclinical Consortium and Clinical Research Consortium to ultimately bring new treatments and therapies to our community and really change the course of TSC. There's a lot of hope and a lot to be excited about for the future. And now I'll turn it to Steve to take you through the science.
Thanks, Lisa. So at this point, it ought to be very clear to everyone why we do what we do and how important it is that we make progress rapidly. And so I want to go through each piece of our infrastructure in a little bit more detail. You've heard about many of these things that I show on this slide, but to think about, I wanted to illustrate over time kind of how these pieces started to fit together. So if you think about the drug development pipeline, which I illustrate at the top with the chevrons, which applies to any sort of new therapy. You start with a hypothesis, you need to get the confidence and the quality that you need to take it into clinical trials and then get it adopted in the clinic and in the marketplace. As Kari mentioned, we started funding research grants at the beginning of this process in 1984, 10 years after we were formed. And that's really helped to generate a number of researchers committed to TSC, and the number keeps growing. A few years later, in 2006, we started the Natural History Database, and that was to collect data on the clinical end of things. How's the disease affecting people? How does it differ from person to person? And then having those two ends of this development pipeline bracketed, we started to fill the gaps in between with, in 2012, the first funded study by our Clinical Research Consortium to start moving biomarkers and eventually therapies into the clinic. In 2014, we started collecting biosamples from people enrolled in our natural history database so that not only do we have the clinical data, we had resources that researchers could use to ask questions about them. And then to facilitate the translational piece from new ideas and hypotheses into moving forward towards clinical trials, we put in place a preclinical research consortium as a partnership between both academia and industry to help move things forward. So I'll talk a little bit about each of these over the next few minutes. As Kari mentioned, our research business plan, we've started in 2019. And in 2019, we're looking at a 7-year business plan to not only raise the funds, but also execute, to really focus research on understanding the course of TSC and how it differs from person to person so that we can alter the course of the disease. This may include prenatal and neonatal diagnosis and preventative treatments to actually intervene before these things that we know are likely to happen in TSC actually happen to people. And of course, to make all this happen, we need the medical professionals and the community at large really well informed of what are the best evidence-based guidelines for care to make the most impact for people living with TSC. And so we have a number of outcomes that we expect to see at the end of our 7-year research plan, including a learning healthcare system to learn from evidence to generate evidence-based guidance. We want to increase the diversity of our preclinical models. We want to accelerate clinical trials. We want to develop biomarkers and be able to evaluate an individual's risk for each of these things that right now we say any of these things could happen, but we're not sure what's going to happen to you or when. And I think that's something that we need to change. So with our innovative research, as I mentioned, we built a pipeline and we continue to build a pipeline of researchers. Now that we have many established researchers, we've actually restricted our grant funding to postdoctoral fellowships and early stage investigators so that we're really helping build that early stage of the pipeline now that we have a number of established investigators in the field. To make sure researchers are well informed and the research community can work together, we sponsor a biennial TSC International Research Conference. We'll have one this October virtually. And then a new part that we've added recently is the concept of innovation workshops to help overcome specific hurdles. So we all know that there are some things that just get in the way and it's hard for an individual lab to address them, but if we come together, we can find a way forward. So by bringing together people from inside and outside the TSC field and having the funds to actually fund the first steps recommended from the workshop, we can move things forward. And an example of that is a newborn screening workshop we held virtually near the end of 2020, and then with a wrap-up virtual meeting in January around newborn screening and what are the first steps that we need to take forward to get, within a few years, be able to actually enable a newborn screening assay for TSC. In terms of our natural history database, since 2006, we've collected data on more than 2,200 people. The data continues to be updated annually. We do this at 18 clinics across the United States, and the TS Alliance is also able to consent and enroll people in the natural history database, which has, within the last 2 years, enabled us to reach out beyond the clinics, these 18 clinics that people go to, so we can diversify both geographically and ethnically the populations that are in our database. We share these data with researchers. So we've had more than 70 requests for data, most academics, but some from companies. We've had some company partnerships to help improve our database as well. And a number of publications have come out of that, as well as information to improve and accelerate the design of clinical trials. The natural history database is also gives us a platform to grow off of. So last year when COVID-19 hit, one of the first questions, as you can imagine, is how is this going to affect people with TSC? Well, nobody knows, nobody knew. And so how can we help understand that? We could help collect data. So we partnered with some investigators at Boston Children's Hospital and reached out to the community and said, if you have a confirmed COVID-19 diagnosis, we'd love to enroll you in this study and collect some basic information about drugs that you're on at the time, drugs you might have used to treat COVID-19, your hospitalization, how did it go, what was the outcome of the disease. Fortunately, people with TSC were pretty good at hunkering down and staying safe, and we only have 20 people enrolled at this point. We know of a few others, so we continue our outreach, and we're also collecting blood samples from those who are willing to participate. And then on the right side of this slide, a slightly different addition that we started in 2019 and are growing over the next couple of years, patient-reported outcomes. Our natural history database started as a clinic entered repository of medical data. But to really add value to that, we want to add the patient perspective directly. And so we partnered with Seizure Tracker, which is an app and a website that allows individuals to track their epilepsy and the medications, potential triggers, what time of day. It even has an Alexa app associated with it. So we have 16 people with TSC or caregivers of those with TSC who have consented to share the data between Seizure Tracker and the natural history database. And of course, we have Biosamples. So we're building this infrastructure that ties these pieces together, again, to help researchers, both at the basic and the clinical level, make progress in TSC. And coming up this year, we're adding patient portals. These are really focused around primarily the neuropsychiatric issues. As you can imagine, those are hard to capture any other way than patient-reported outcomes. There are lots of survey instruments and things like that out there, but really hearing directly from the people who are living with this on a day-to-day basis is probably the best way to collect data. So we're excited about the growth in that direction. As I mentioned, we're collecting biosamples from people in our natural history database. What does that mean? Well, we started by consenting through the clinics who were collecting the medical data into the natural history database and getting people enrolled. And then we also realized there were opportunities with our Clinical Research Consortium, which I'll mention in a moment. They were undertaking clinical studies, and we said, well, why don't we help collect the biosamples? You put in the protocol, the informed consent to collect blood. Let's not, instead of you spending time collecting it and storing it in your academic laboratories, why don't we do it? We'll store it at a biorepository that we contract with. And then not only is it available to the project, but it becomes a permanent part of the collection for TSC research, overseen by the TS Alliance for the foreseeable future. They were very willing to partner on this. And so not only did we do the first start collecting from the first study, which was the Rare Disease Clinical Research Network that Kari mentioned. We started collecting from the PREVENT study, which I'll mention in a moment. And we also got some samples from a study, a clinical study on autism that was performed before we had our biosample repository, and those are shown here in yellow. So we were able to transfer and add those in. So all told, we've got over 1,600 samples available. We've shared over 1,000 over the last couple of years for things like biomarker and genetics research, et cetera. So we're very excited about the prospects for that as we continue to collect samples and share them and collect the data that researchers generate. The Preclinical Consortium, as I mentioned, is that translational piece and the newest of the projects that I'm discussing. We knew it needed to be a public-private partnership. It needed to involve the TS Alliance, academic researchers, and industry. And so far we've had 16 companies join. We have them join a year at a time. So you can just join, maybe test your compound. If it doesn't happen to work in TSC, business changes, the company can go away, but we've still got that connection. But we actually currently have 10 companies, the most we've ever had active at one time, that are current partners with us in this preclinical consortium. So that, I think, speaks to the niche that this filled to engage with companies, most of them small, but a few of them very large, to help accelerate their discovery and their interest in TSC. We involve the TSC community members on our steering committee, as well as academic experts in TSC. One of the key things about the consortium is facilitating access to animal models and consistent testing processes. So we actually talked with, the experts, said which of the animal models of TSC, because there are lots of them, are really the most robust, reproducible, and translatable. Let's bring those in. TS Alliance gets licenses to actually do work with those animals in partnership with companies. So companies don't necessarily have to go and get their own license. They can jump in and do the work. We also put the animals at a CRO so that the work is done by contract research folks who are, their full-time day job is performing these kinds of rigorous preclinical experiments, rather than an academic lab where it's, something done on the side or something that needs to be done for publication, et cetera. So putting these pieces in place, I think, has made it very attractive and productive. So since August of 2016, we've run 55 experiments testing 45 different compounds, and that will continue to go up as we go through the year. This is an outline of a simplified version of the MTOR pathway, things feeding into and out of it. And you can see TSC1 and 2 genes at the center as a key regulator of MTOR activity, which affects cell proliferation, survival, and basic metabolism. A number of these compounds are shown, or mechanisms are shown in blue. These were funded by the TS Alliance. These were compounds nominated by academic investigators. We run the study, pay for it, share the data with the investigators and the consortium members. But many companies come in and run their own experiments. Those are shown in green, but these are the ones that companies have chosen to share with us. They don't have to share the data. We realize it's very important for IP purposes and competitive purposes that they need to own the rights to the data. So we actually have many more company experiments that aren't shown on here because of that. But there has been movement forward thanks to engagement with the Preclinical Consortium. I'll just focus on a couple of these for today. One in the upper left is Company A. This is a small biotech that came to us with very little funding, ran an early compound, got positive efficacy data in working with us, and was able to take those data back together with their other data and generate millions of dollars in venture cap funding. They're now working with us very aggressively on TSC with improving their compounds and generating a clinical candidate. In the middle, the TS Alliance funded a study with a MEK inhibitor. This actually was nominated by an academic investigator. It was effective in both the tumor growth models and the epilepsy models. And so we're engaged in discussions, partnering discussions with that to help move that forward, potentially into clinical trials. And then in the lower right, there's another company that has run one of their compounds in a model, seen a positive response, and is looking to start a clinical trial as well. Would have started already, I think, if COVID-19 hadn't come along. And so then I want to wrap up with the Clinical Research Consortium. The consortium, as Kari mentioned, was founded, the first study was funded in 2012, actually came out of a discussion at our research conference in 2011. Started with 5 sites, but we've expanded those sites over time as we grew the number of studies and the need to enroll more people into those studies. And so I'll touch on a few of those. In the interest of time, I think I'll go fairly quickly, but what this timeline illustrates are the NIH-funded studies in epilepsy in green and in autism in orange that the consortium has carried out. So first there was an epilepsy biomarker study. This just was observational. It followed children with TSC before the onset of seizures. As I mentioned with the cardiac rhabdomyomas, you can get that early diagnosis sometimes. And so we were able to really understand the progression and the changes in EEG that occur leading up to before the clinical seizures start. And so this led to the PREVENT trial, which is using vigabatrin to actually intervene as soon as the EEG starts to change and before the clinical seizures start. So this is before somebody would normally get treated with a drug. That's fully enrolled. We expect it to read out late this year, and very exciting to see if this early intervention really makes a difference, not only in epilepsy, but also in the developmental outcomes, which are poor developmental outcomes are strongly associated with early onset and poorly controlled epilepsy. On the autism side, the Autism Center of Excellence Network did a biomarker study, again, following infants up to the age of 3 years to take MRI, EEG, and a number of behavioral and developmental tests along the way to document the development of autism in people with TSC, and again, set the stage for that early intervention. And that first major publication is submitted, so we know that data will be out soon. And finally, I'll end with the JETS intervention. So it's not just about clinical studies, but it's about intervention as well. The JETS is looking at a behavioral intervention in children with TSC who are at risk of autism, and looking at, again, changing the course of the disease in people. And so with that, and a really rapid fire overview of our projects, I want to turn it over to Kari to wrap it up with an overview.
Thank you, Steve. So you heard about the platform that we have built to create infrastructure in combating tuberous sclerosis complex. This is an overview of the outcomes that we hope to accomplish with our research business plan, with the goal of changing the course of TSC. So with the natural history database and biosample repository, we want to be able to predict the risk of TSC manifestations. We want to be able to accelerate outcome measures and identify new drug targets that we can develop through our pipeline. If we go from that into preclinical, we want to take those drugs and test them and screen them in the animal models, both that are academically nominated and with industry, and then ultimately, right, move them into clinical trials so that we are rapidly but proficiently developing new drugs to treat the many manifestations of TSC, and in fact, preventing some of the manifestations of TSC. And then when we look at innovative research, that's really looking, what is the emerging science where we want to bring researchers together to really push that really engaging new research forward. Steve talked about newborn screening. I'll also add gene therapy in there. This is a very emerging science that we feel very hopeful about combating TSC in the future. So that's just a overview look of what we're hoping to accomplish over the 7 years of our research business plan. And in the end, it's because we will give everything but up in the fight against TSC and creating a more hopeful future. And thanks for listening to us today.
Wow. I mean, it's almost 50 years that it's taken, right?
That's, yeah.
You know, and you've put these building blocks in place, you know, and I think that if there's a gift from COVID, is that we have learned as a science community to mobilize on a target. And I think there's you know, if there's something that we hope remains as we create a new culture of science and the science economy and so on, it's really that. And you've made just, you know, wonderful impact. I want to invite Michael Welling to say a few words, because I could feel like you might have been jumping up and down a little bit watching this, Michael. And is this what we want to be, or what? Will we grow up?
Well, wow. And when I say that I'm speechless, you can gather that's a big deal for me. I am rarely speechless. And Lisa, let me just say, as a parent of a child who every milestone is an amazing milestone, 7 months, episode free, I got goosebumps just talking about it. You know, and not to go into sort of my whole story, but believe me, there was enough instances where, you know, I heard this never happened. We don't know why this is. We don't know what the outcome's going to be. And my kid, Matthew's 15 years old and has overcome every single, you know, obstacle and challenge and defied the odds in so many ways that my heart just goes out for you and couldn't be rooting harder for you. And just for the work that the whole team, Steve and Kari, that you guys are doing. Yeah, I mean, I texted Joanne and I just said, holy blueprint, Batman. Like, what an unbelievable example of what every organization should be looking to emulate as they go out there and try and tackle some of these challenges, so many of which there's no answer. And, you know, how many times is it, we don't know what this is, we don't know what to do? I mean, that there's nothing that should ever be said like that to a parent. And part of our experience was Matthew, at 1 year of age, went through 2 separate unrelated anonymous stem cell transplants. The first one had failed. And part of my sort of personal mission and driving for all this, bringing people together, is I never wanted any parent ever to hear, go home and wait while your child might die because we don't know what we can do. So I am blown away. I am encouraged and invigorated with some of the stuff that we've been trying to figure out what to do. And you guys, you don't need to hear it from me, but should be so proud of what you've accomplished, not just the successes you've had, but taking on the challenge and pushing through it. And cannot imagine how many meetings you had where it was, are we doing the right thing? Is this ever going to work? So again, I don't know what else to say other than wow, because that really was impressive. Thank you for sharing.